And welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And,
Amen.
and we'll get right into things here. Oops. Let's see, here we are. So we are moving right along in Parshat Yitro. We finished reading about the Ten Commandments, and as you can see, we're in the maftir portion of Parshat Yitro. So we've almost completed all the Rashis on this. So, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, and God said, or the Lord Hashem said to Moses, Ko tomar el bnei Yisrael, thus shall you say to the children of Israel, Atem reitem, you have seen, ki min hashamayim dibarti imachem, that I spoke to you from the heavens, Let's take a look. Kotumar. So what's the force of the thus? Thus you shall say. Belashon hazeh. That you should express it precisely this way. This is how you should tell them. Atem reitem, you have seen. Yesh hefresh, and Rashi says there's a distinction bein ma she'adam ro'eh, from what a person actually sees, lema she'acherim mesichin lo, from that which others tell him. So to see it, right? Seeing is believing, right? So Shema, because it's possible, she'acherim mesiim lo ha'amim, shelibo chaluk mila ha'amim. Okay, so here this isn't Shema, but Shema, that because that she'acherim mesichin lo, that others tell him, ha'amim, there are times shelibo chaluk mila ha'amim, that his heart puts him away, right? Goes in a different direction from believing them. So we don't always believe what we're told, but what we see, we see. Ki min hashamayim dibarti, that I spoke to you from the heavens. V'chatuv echad omer, but there's another passage that says, Vayered Hashem al Har Sinai, that Hashem came down onto Mount Sinai. Bahakatuv Hashlishi. So we now have two verses that appear to contradict each other, but now we have a third verse, right? The Hichriya Beinehem, which then allows us to compromise both of them, right? It gives us a place in which to understand where this is leaning. And that's in Deuteronomy 4, where it says, Min hashamayim hashmiacha et kolo, right? From the heavens, he caused you to hear his voice, liasrecha, to instruct you. The al haaretz, the verse goes on to say, and on the earth, heracha et isho, he showed you, right? So you heard from the heavens, and you saw his fire, Hagdolah, his great fire, Kvodo Bashamayim, that is to say, his glory, his presence is in the heavens, Ve'isho Ugvurato ala aretz, but his fire and his power is on the earth. So there's the combination of both how on the appearance and the presence of God. Davar acher, another interpretation. Hirchin shamayim, he inclined the heavens, ushmei shamayim, and the heaven of heavens, vehitzian hala'ar, and he spread them out on the mountain. V'chein hu omer, and so it says in Psalm 18, Vayet shamayim vayered, he inclined the heavens and he came down. Again, speaking in deeply symbolic language, trying to understand this too literally, I think will draw us away from the intention. But of course, essentially the intention is the way in which God's presence was revealed to people, that God caused people to be able to sense the divine power that is normally hidden from us. And I think so that's why we talk about revelation. Next verse. Lo ta'asun iti, you shall not make with me or of me, Elohei chesef, gods of silver, Elohei zahav, or gods of gold. Lo ta'asu lachem, you shall not make for yourselves. So again, need to parse out this sentence. Lo ta'asun iti, right? You should not make with me. Rashi explains the Hebrew, lo ta'asun demut. Okay, so iti can mean with me. You shall not make with me. So in other words, you shouldn't make an image, shimshai, of my servants, hamishamshim lefanai bamarom, who serve me before me in the heavens. So, in other words, the idea of making uh, images, right, of or figures of things that serve God, but obviously aren't God themselves. There's no way that you can make an image of God at all, because that isn't something you can see directly. Elohei Kesef, so gods of silver. Baal lahashir al hakruvim. So very interesting that he came to warn us regarding the cherubim. In other words, to give us, tell us not to do something regarding the cherubim. That is, there were two cherubim that were made on the ark cover when they made the tabernacle, and it's to tell us that these cherubim she'ata oseh amud iti, that you create to stand with me, because the ark in a way represents the divine throne. It's symbolic of the divine throne, and you have these two cherubim on either side of the ark cover. Shelo yu shel kesef, that they should not be made out of silver. She'im shenitem la'asotam shel kesef, because if you altered the instructions to make them out of silver, hare hen lefanai ki elahut, I'm going to see them as idols, essentially, as gods. The fact that you did not listen to me, you didn't, because God instructs them to make it out of gold, that if you make it out of silver, you're going against God's instructions and God's commandments. And so consequently, it's as if you're treating these cherubim as more powerful in a way, right? So that's how I'm going to look at them. Velohei zahav, and gods of gold, Baal lahazhir. So this comes to warn you, shelo yosif al shtayim, that there should not be any more than two of them, because they were made out of gold. So here we're talking about that one has not permitted to make more than two. She'im asita arba, because if you make four, hare hein lefanai kelohei zahav, I'm going to look at them again as if you made them as idols of gold. And so there's an interesting insight here that in not following divine instruction, especially when it comes to things such as this, right? Like making the cherubim. When you do it, when you alter the initial instruction, it's in a sense idolatry, and maybe not just in a sense. That is a way of not worshiping God, not putting God as the ultimate source of our loyalty. Lo ta'asu lachem, you should not make for yourselves. Lo tomar, you shouldn't say, Hareini oseh kruvim bevatei knisiot. In other words, you shouldn't make cherubim in synagogues, uvatei midrashot, and in places of study, right, in the study halls. Kederech sha'ani oseh bevet olamim. The way and I think this is possibly still referring to oneself, just as I made in the temple. L'chach ne'emar, and for this it says, Lo ta'asu lachem, you should not make for yourselves. In other words, for the sake of God in the temple, that's okay, you can make them there. But to make such objects for your synagogues or your homes or other, places even that would appear to be places of worship on some kind of level, it's not appropriate. And were this not to be said, we might think it were. Next, Mizbach Adama, an altar of earth. Ta'aseli, you shall make for me. Vezavachta alav et olotecha, and you shall slaughter. Alav normally means upon it, but Rashi's going to tell us it doesn't mean actually on the altar itself. He's going to tell us it actually means next to it. Et olotecha, your whole offerings, ve'et shlamecha, and your peace offerings, et soncha, your sheep, ve'et bekarecha, and your cattle. B'chol hamakom, at every place, asher askir et shmi, where I make my name mentioned, right? Avo elecha uverachticha, I will come to you and I will bless you. So remember, the context of all of this is in relationship to the Ten Commandments and what it does in terms of defining our relationship with God. Mizbach Adama, altar of earth, mechubar ba'adama. So when it says an altar of earth, it means it's attached to the earth. Shelo yivanenu al gabe amudim. He should not build this altar on top of pillars, or al gabe. This looks like a kafis. And Lauren, do you have a translation? I missed this one when I was preparing.
Yeah, it says block
Oh,
of wood, and then it says another version on a base.
Right, there it is. You see the next page, and I'm pointing to it. Nusach acher, right? A different version. Basis means a base. So what did they say a kafis was? Did they mention?
Block of wood.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right. Thank you. I'm going to write that in. Oops. That's straightened. Okay. Thank you. All right. So in other words, it has to be somehow attached to the earth. Davar acher, another interpretation, shehaya memale et halal hamizbeach hanechoshet, and that is they actually were using a bronze altar outside in the tabernacle. When they made the tabernacle, it was made out of bronze, and they would fill memale, they would fill the empty space in this altar, right, on the inside. Now the bronze altar, they would fill that empty space, Adama, with earth, b'sha'at chaniyatam, at the time when they had their encampment. So that's another way of understanding this. Ta'aseh li, you should make for me, shetahei tchilat asiyato lishmi. And what it's saying is that when you do this, you should declare that you're doing it for the sake of God, that you're putting the earth or putting it on the earth for this because God has commanded you to do it. V'zavachta alav, and you should slaughter. Alav, you might think means upon it. I mentioned this. Etzlo, but what it means is near it, right by it. And he gives other examples where alav means next to. For alav mate menashe. So in Numbers chapter 2, where they're talking about the setup of the camp, they mention a tribe and they use the word alav with the next tribe. That next to it, the tribe of Menashe. Again, the Mechilta. And also in Tractate Zevachim, page 58. O eino ela alav mamash. Well, wait a second. Let's not jump to conclusions. Maybe it does mean actually that you're supposed to slaughter these animals on the altar itself. Talmud lomar, and for this reason, Scripture teaches habasar v'hadam al mizbach Hashem Elokecha. It talks about the flesh and the blood being on the altar of the Lord your God. The ein shchita, so that since it's already the flesh and the blood that's on the altar, the ein shchita barosh hamizbeach, And so we understand and confer from that the slaughter itself is not at the top of the altar, on the altar itself, only the flesh and the blood. Et olotecha ve'et shlamecha, your whole offerings and your peace offerings, asher mitzoncha umibakarecha. It goes on to say your flock and your cattle. So in other words, your whole offerings and your peace offerings, which are from your flock and from your cattle. Et soncha ve'et bekarcha, or bekarecha, the et there, perush, le'at olotecha, perush le quote, et olotecha ve'et shlamecha. In other words, he's saying this is an explanation of what the Torah is saying when it says et olotecha ve'et shlamecha, that this is an explanation of that. At every place where I make mention of my name, literally, asher eten lacha reshut. So what that means, this mentioning of God's name, is where I give you permission, lahaskir shem hamafurash. In other words, where you have permission to express the specific name of God, the divine name itself, sheli, of mine. Sham avo elecha. It's in such places where I will come to you, uverachticha, and I will bless you. Tashre shchinati alecha. My divine presence will rest upon you. Mikan, and from this atalamed, you can learn from this. You can infer shelo nitan reshut laskir shema furash. And from this, you can infer that one is not permitted to actually articulate God's divine name. Ela b'makom she'ashchina ba'a. You can only do that in a place where the divine presence comes, sham there, v'zehu beit ha'bechira, and we're referring, of course, here to the chosen house, meaning the temple. Sham nitan reshut. It's there that permission is given, lakohanim laskir shema mafurash, where the priests are allowed to articulate God's specific divine name, b'nesiat kapayim, when they raise their hands, levarech ha'am, to bless the people. At that point, what they can use God's personal divine name. Onwards, ve'im mizbach avanim tasdeli, and if you were to make me, or are to make me, a altar of stones, Lo tivne uten gazit, you should not build them in such a way that they're hewn, that the stones themselves are cut. Ki charbacha nafta alecha, because you have lifted your sword on it, utechalaleha, and profaned these stones, so that they're no longer sacred, because you've used your sword or some kind of knife to smooth them, etc., to work with them. So, ve'im mizbach avanim, and if you make an altar of stones, and the Mechilta, Rabbi Yishmael says, Kol im ve'im shabbat Torah. In other cases where you have the word im, meaning if, right? Reshut, that it's saying that it's in a way permission. Im means if you want to, you can. If you don't want to, you don't have to. Chutz mishlosha, except for 3 cases. The im mizbech avanim, right? So it's this im mizbech avanim or mizbach. Let me make sure. Mizbach avanim, forgive me. If you make an altar of stone, ta'aseli, you shall make for me. Hare im zeh, he says, this case of the word im mishamesh belashon kasher. There it just means this if isn't as a condition. It's simply saying when you make for me an altar of stones. And when you make for me an altar of stones, you shouldn't construct them as cut stones. Because in fact it's an obligation for you, livnot mizbach avanim, to actually build an altar of stones. Shneimar, how do we know this? in Deuteronomy chapter 27, Avanim shleimot tivneh, you shall use whole stones. V'chein, and likewise in Exodus chapter 22, im kesef tilveh. Okay, so there is one where it says another im, which says if you lend out silver, and it means when you lend out silver. Chovahu, it's actually an obligation to lend silver, in other words, to a poor person. V'ha'avat tavi, okay. V'ha'avet ta'avitenu, which means I believe that you should, in fact, lend him the money, etc., etc. And so this af also in its context means and you do, because you're obligated to do it. And likewise the third case in Leviticus chapter 2, ve'im takriv minchat bikurim, and literally, right, and when you offer up a mincha, a meal offering of bikurim, of first fruits. Zo minchat ha'omer, and this is referring in Leviticus chapter 2, it's the mincha offering, the meal offering of the omer, shehi chovah, which is in fact an obligation, v'al korchacha, ein im halalu, and you are forced to say that these particular cases of the word im, tluyim, you forgive me, you cannot say that they are conditional. They're saying if, right? You're forced to say that these cases, these three cases, are not conditional, ella vadaim, but in fact they're certain. They're actually a commandment. Uvelashon kasher hem mishamshim, and the im in this case simply means when. You have to do it, when you do it, etc. Gazit, this word gazit, lashon gaziza. So it has the meaning of gaziza, which means to shear or to cut, etc. Sheposlan umikatatam bazel. That is to say, if he shaped them through chipping them or shaping them with metal, these stones, if he does that. Ki charbecha hinafta aleha, because you have lifted your sword against it. Hare ki ze, and he says the word ki charbecha, right? For you have raised your sword against it. This word ki, ze mishamesh belashon pen. This we should understand it as lest. Shahu dilma. That's the normal Hebrew dilma, possibly. Dilma pen tanif ter charbecha aleha, right? Dilma, perhaps, lest you have lifted your sword against it. Utachalaleha, and you are going to profane it. Ha lamadata, and from this you learn, she'im henafta aleha bazel, that if in fact you wield sword against the stone, halalta, you have now made it, you've desanctified it, right? Okay, this is chapter 3 of Tractate Midot, which tells you the dimensions of the temple. Shehamizbech nivra laharich yamav, because the idea of the altar is to let you live longer, to give you length of days, shel adam, for a human being. V'habarzel nivra lekatzer yamav, and we know that metal was created in order to shorten his days, shel adam, of a person, of a human being. Ein ze badin, and so it makes no sense, sheyunaf hamakatzer al hamarich, that you should in fact wield the object that shortens people's days on the object that in fact is there to lengthen people's days. Va'od, and moreover, shehamizbeach matil shalom ben Yisrael la'avihem shebashamayim. Not only that, but the altar makes it possible to create peace between Israel and their Father in heaven. Lefichach lo yavo alav koret umechabel, and for this reason, one shouldn't place upon it or wield against it something that cuts off and does damage. And we can learn a fortiori argument, kal vachomer, from this. Here we go. Uma avanim, and if in the case of stones, she'enan ro'ot velo shomit, with stones that don't see and don't hear, velo medabrot, and they don't speak, al yedei shematilot shalom, okay, because they are there to help cause peace, right, to place peace. Amra Torah lo tanif alehem barzel, and in that particular case, the Torah has said that you shouldn't wield a sword against them. Hamatil shalom bein ish ishto, in a case of someone who places peace, who creates peace between a man and his wife, bein mishpacha lemishpacha, or between families, bein adam lechavero, or between simply a fellow and his neighbor and his companion, alachad kama v'chala. How much the more so, shelo tevoehu puranot, that in that case he is going to be blessed. That if in fact we are blessed for the fact that we haven't done this to the stones of the altar, certainly if you don't do it to someone who's a living, breathing human being, you're going to be blessed. Let's see if we can finish this up. You shall not go up on steps to my altar, asher lo tegale ervacha alav, so that you do not reveal your nakedness upon it, upon these steps, in other words. Let's take a look here. You should not take steps to go up my altar. When you build a ramp to the altar, because the altar was quite high, lo ta'asehu ma'alot. You shouldn't make this ramp consist of steps. Eskol, you can hear eskol has to do with scale, right? The word scale, and the word scale means a ladder. Belaz in French, in Old French, and in Yiddish, stupen, stoplen. Excuse me. So you can see it means steps. Ela chalak, but it should be smooth. Yehei umishupa. It should be smooth and slanting up to the altar, this ramp. Asher lo tegale ervacha, so that you do not reveal your nakedness. She'al yedei hama'alot, because if you take steps, atat sarich laharchiv psiotecha, because when you take one step to the next step, you have to take large steps, you have to take broad steps. And my understanding is that the priests, when they walked, basically walked heel to toe. And despite the fact that it's not that you're actually revealing your private parts, in other words, what it's talking about, your nakedness, Sha'arei Kativ, because elsewhere we see it written, it says, you shall make for the priests pants of linen. Okay, but nevertheless, and these were these like shorts that they put on. Nevertheless, harchavat hapsiot, that the fact that you're taking these large steps up the altar ramp, karov legilui erva, it's very close, it's very similar to revealing your nakedness. It is. And consequently, you're treating these steps, right? You're treating the ramp of the altar in a disrespectful way by taking these large steps. And again, we could infer another lesson from this. Uma avadim, and just in the case of stones halalu, these stones, she'ein bahem da'at lakpid, because they don't have any consciousness, they're not aware, lakpid ala azbiz yonan, to basically take offense at the fact that they're being treated disrespectfully. Amra Torah, and nevertheless the Torah said, Ho'il v'yesh bahem tzorech, all right? And because we have a need for them, I think is how we'd understand this, right? Lo tinhag bahem minhag bizayon. You shouldn't treat them in a disrespectful way, these stones. or these steps. Chaverecha, your fellow, shehu bidmut yotzrecha, who is in the image of your creator, umakpid al bizuno, and he cares, right? He has feelings if he is treated disrespectfully. Alachat kama v'chama, how much the more so. And chasalt Parshat Yitro, and we have come to the end of explaining Parshat Yitro. The need here, of course, to treat a person respectfully and not to be disrespectful. So, I'm going to stop the share and stop the recording. And we have come to the end of explaining Parshat Yitro in the Rashi. So I'm going to stop the recording.